Thanks, Jay, for this invitation, and congratulations to Unni and Jay and the entire team for this wonderful meeting. So we all know that TB uveitis practically can involve any part of the eye. And why do we need imaging in TB-associated uveitis? It's important in identifying the disease pattern, to measure the disease activity, for assessing various sequelae and complications, and probably to understand the pathogenesis of intraocular TB, and we'll see it how. So coming to the first and the most common tool, fundus photography, which we use for all intermediate, pan, and posterior uveitis. It's used for documenting resolution of active lesions, and I use it almost to show to every patient, to convince how he's responding to the treatment, and it helps in generating a lot of confidence in the patient towards you, or to identify any new lesions, because we deal with very often with paradoxical worsening of lesions in these eyes, or to grade vitritis, the vitreous haze, by these digital images. The fundus fluorescein angiography helps us to differentiate the TB retinal vasculitis from the other forms of vasculitis by revealing extensive capillary non-perfusion, or in an apparently silent fundus which has just this perivascular choroiditis scar, reveals extensive peripheral retinal neovascularization, or sometimes in a severe macular exudative maculopathy, where we can think of lots of differential diagnoses unless we do a fluorescein angiography, which simply diagnoses an idiopathic retinal vasculitis and neuroretinitis. And we have found association of TB in some of these cases. ICG angiography, we were classically taught about its role in the serpiginous-like choroiditis, but I find it much more useful in these conditions where some of these conditions where you just see a patient presents with disc edema in both the eyes, and there is a retinal hemorrhage besides in the peripapillary region, and this patient was erroneously referred as papilledema. When you see these subtle lesions in the choroid, you need to go for the combined FFA and ICG angiography. The FFA did not show much except some disc hyperfluorescence, but we could make a diagnosis solely based on the ICG angiography, which showed lots of choroidal granulomas in both the eyes in the entire fundus. Ultra-wide field imaging is important in identifying the peripheral choroiditis lesions, and we are likely to miss these recurrences if we don't pay attention to the peripheral fields. Also applies to the paradoxical worsening of the peripheral lesions. Coming to the fundus autofluorescence, it is greatly enhanced in clinical detection of early pathological event of acute stage of posterior uveitis, especially the multifocal serpiginoid choroiditis. We have these 4 stages if the patient presents to you in the stage 1, where we have a halo which is represented in A, and when the hyperautofluorescence starts decreasing and gets replaced by hypoautofluorescence, we know very well that the lesions are healing and where we know we need to stop our corticosteroid treatment. I find it more useful in eyes like this, which often present to us because ours is a tertiary center, and many of these patients have had treatment elsewhere, and these present with a lot of scarring in the fundus. So do you really need to treat these patients? When we do a fluorescein angiography, it just shows transmission defects. We don't have any clue whether there's any activity going on. But if you do an autofluorescence, you can pick up these subtle subclinical lesions, and you know that you have to treat these patients. A third condition where you have active lesions, you're monitoring them, you've seen them on fundus autofluorescence and on fluorescein, but when you clinically monitor them, it's hard to tell how they're responding, because if you look at the digital images at 3 months, 8 months, and 13 months, they practically look the same. But we have to have autofluorescence in these kind of eyes where you can see a lot of variation in the amount of autofluorescence progressing from hyper to hypoautofluorescence. Fourth condition where a patient has been following up with you since almost 10 years, and you just pick up a subtle reactivation just based on the fundus autofluorescence by a peripheral active lesion, which you don't see on the clinical photograph. We tried to correlate these fundus autofluorescence changes with the spectral domain OCT, and we found that in these eyes, there were a lot of changes occurring in the outer retina, and we could grade the various changes that were taking place along with the fundus autofluorescence. This was way back in 2011, and since there was molecular evidence of the Mycobacterium TB residing in the RPE from various reports, by our imaging analysis, we were convinced that the primary site of inflammation in TB serpiginous-like choroiditis is probably the RPE. But since the ICG had been showing the choroidal involvement in TB serpiginous-like choroiditis, we wanted to explore the choroid, and based on the differences between the spectral domain and the EDI-OCT, we took up this study to correlate the fundus autofluorescence findings with the changes taking place in the choroid. We wanted to know what happens to the choroid as a whole in serpiginous-like choroiditis, what happens to the choroid locally under the active lesion in different stages, and what happens to the choroid actually before developing any new lesions. So this is an example of an active serpiginous in the right eye. The left eye is completely scarred. If you see the topmost scan, you see diffuse choroidal swelling, diffuse choroidal thickening in the active stage. And when you start treating these patients, you go down to the last frame where you see the choroidal thickening is decreasing. And in the area of choroid just beneath the lesion, there is choroidal atrophy. Now, the second finding, in cases of paradoxical worsening, same thing happens when you have active lesions persisting and probably new lesions coming up. The choroidal thickening does not decrease. In fact, there is a slight increase in the choroidal thickening during the paradoxical event until the lesions heal, and then ultimately you land up with decrease in the choroidal thickening. So this is the changes that you can see in the initial insult. There's a lot of hyperreflective foci, probably suggesting a cellular infiltration, a granuloma, and a diffuse thickening of the choroid, and 8 months you see everything is gone. This is another example where we have seen that there is regeneration of the external limiting membrane and the photoreceptors at the end of the healing stage. The choroidal thickness decreases, but there is no choroidal atrophy. So the areas which do not develop choroidal atrophy probably are the ones where the external limiting membrane and the photoreceptors are going to regenerate. So we found diffuse choroidal thickening in the active stage. Now, how does this choroidal thickening come from? Probably there is inflammation of the choroidal vessels, which leads to an altered ocular blood flow, and then there is an increased accumulation of the exudates. The choroidal thickening might indicate an immunological trigger, and the RPE with the outer retinal changes may indicate the infective trigger. Choriocapillaris, or the large vessels mainly involved, we don't know which part. Since there is significant scarring in TB serpiginous-like choroiditis as against VKH or sympathetic ophthalmia or sarcoidosis, the choriocapillaries seem to be equally involved along with outer retina. Primary stromal choroiditis based on our EDI findings is unlikely in TB MSC because the compartments are not respected and there are significant changes in the outer retina as well. Coming to OCT angiography, this is an example where a patient presented to us with sheath vessels in the right eye, suggestive of a healed vasculitis. But he was symptomatic. Something was going on in the macula in the right eye. So we did an OCT and we found that there were some cystic spaces, but there was an RPE bump also. So are we dealing with a CNVM or are we dealing with a choroidal granuloma? Combined fluorescein and ICG confused us further because the ICG showed a granuloma, but the FFA did not rule out a CNVM, as we see in all the frames. So how do we diagnose? Simply, when we did the OCT angiography, we could see a nice network of the vessels, suggesting that this was a case of an inflammatory CNVM and not a choroiditis. So we need to watch out for inflammatory CNVM in these eyes with scarred uveitis, where the OCT is giving you a clue, but we need to spend a lot of time on fluorescein to be able to diagnose. But unless you do an OCT angiography, you see the network very well, and you can see the entire network there. So this is a correlation of the autofluorescence with the ICG, as Dr. Vishali has already shown. You have flow void areas in the OCT angiography in the active stage, but this is, if you compare it with an eye which is completely scarred in active stage, you can see that the flow void areas have decreased, and you can see an intertwined meshwork of the vessels. So not to forget the anterior uveitis in TB, we document them on slit lamp photography because granulomas and granulomatous inflammation is very common in TB, just to show how the patient is responding. And since TB is a chronic uveitis, we often see these patients of complicated cataract. And this is an example, a young woman who had been to 8 doctors before coming to us. All of them were anterior segment surgeons. She was advised phacoemulsification with an intraocular lens. Probably attention was not paid to her intraocular pressure, which was only 5. So in these eyes with hypotony, we need to have a UBM, which showed a cyclitic membrane, 360 degrees ciliary body atrophy, and it changes the entire surgical plan of the patient. Thank you very much.